Hello everyone. Welcome to the videos on neuromuscular basis of movement. We are going to be dividing these into 4 parts to keep the files a little bit more manageable. In the first part, we're going to go through the divisions of the nervous system and talk about cellular structure. In the second part, we're going to look at the development and organization of the peripheral nerves, and then how the nerve impulses is generated, and then how it travels and is delivered. In the third part, we will look at motor units and receptors, and then lastly, we will look at the parts of the nervous system that participate in the control of voluntary movement. You can go ahead and just follow along with your lecture outline, and if you wanted to, you could print out and look at the slides. Again, if you looked on Blackboard, the lecture outline and the PowerPoint slides are all in one file, but again, the videos will be in 4 different files. So let's go ahead and get started. So here we can see the divisions of the nervous system. Basically, the 2 major divisions are the central and the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system is pretty straightforward: brain and spinal cord. That's pretty much it. Everything else is in the peripheral nervous system. So again, here's brain and spinal cord in our central nervous system, and then the peripheral nervous system. Here they're just showing you some examples of the sensory and motor neurons, and we'll be looking at those in more detail in just a little bit. Just another way to look at it, a little bit more of a table format. Central nervous system again in blue, brain and spinal cord. So in the peripheral nervous system we have the peripheral nerves, and that includes 12 cranial nerves. It includes the 31 pairs of paired spinal nerves, all the nerves that actually have names, and as well as the autonomic nervous system. And you can see here the autonomic nervous system is divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And we'll be looking at each of these in a little bit more detail. So here are the cranial nerves, and in case you're not sure exactly what you're looking at here, this is the brain, and basically what you can see on top here is an eyeball. So this is the front bottom of the brain. So it's as if the person was looking at you, and then you put your hands on either side of their head and flipped their head up so they're looking at the ceiling, and you're looking at the bottom of their brain. So cranial nerves are just that. They come off of the brainstem, and since the brainstem is within the cranium, that's how they get the name cranial nerves. There are 12 pair, and you are not going to be required for this class to learn the names or functions of those nerves, but you are going to have a neuro class at some point, and you will be learning them in great detail at that point. So some examples: we have an olfactory nerve, which is for smell, an optic nerve for sight, a bunch of nerves that help to move the eyes, facial nerve, that's innervating structures in the face. We've got a vestibular cochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve 8, which is for hearing and also for the vestibular system. And then we have a bunch of nerves that control the tongue, the vagus nerve, which does just a whole bunch of different stuff. And then the spinal accessory nerve, which you'll see actually helps innervate some of the muscles that we're going to be looking at when we get to the spine, like the upper trapezius. So these are the cranial nerves, and again, they do both motor and sensory functions. Oh, you might have noticed cranial nerves are numbered 1 through 12, but we always use the Roman numeral and not Arabic numerals. So cranial nerves are numbered with Roman numerals. Next, we have the spinal nerves, and there are 31 paired nerves. In other words, there's a right and a left, and so we number those based on the segment of the spine in which they're exiting. So we have 8 cranial nerves, even though we only have 7 cervical nerves. Even though we only have 7 cervical vertebra, we have 8 cranial nerves, so we call them C1 through C8. There are 12 thoracic nerves. That goes along with 12 ribs in the thorax, 12 thoracic vertebra, 5 lumbar nerves, and then we have sacral and coccygeal nerves. So we aren't going to be doing a lot with the sacral nerves at all, but we will be looking extensively at the nerves coming out of the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar areas. So again, just another way to look at the central and peripheral nervous systems, and in green you can see the vertebral nerves exiting here on the right hand side. Also in the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous system, and it looks a lot like automatic nervous system, and that's not really a bad way to think about it, just don't say automatic, but you can think automatic. In other words, these are the nerves that control functions that aren't generally under voluntary control. Things like, is your pupil in your eye constricting or dilating? Are you salivating? Is your gallbladder working? What about your bladder? Things like that. So you can see here that those nerves come out of the parasympathetic system, comes out of the cranial area and the sacral area, and then the sympathetic nerves come out along the thoracic area. So again, we're not going to go in a great detail in those. It's important for you to understand how they help to control homeostatic functions, and again, you'll be looking at this in more detail when you get to your neuro class. But the autonomic nervous system, as we've touched on in patient interventions, does contribute to control very strongly of blood pressure and temperature and pulse and heart rate and respiratory rate. Those things are all very important. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is fight or flight, and so that's going to be controlling things like when the saber-toothed tiger is running after you, we're going to be dilating the eyes so you can see well, and we're going to be sending a lot of blood flow to your big muscles and to your heart and to your lungs, but we're going to be shutting down blood flow to internal organs and things like that. By contrast, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be during rest, relaxation, and recuperation. So you're going to be sending a lot more blood flow to your digestive system, your urinary system, reproductive system, those types of areas. All right, so what I'd like to do then is transition into talking about the fundamental building block of the nervous system, which is the neuron. It is important that we understand the cellular structure of the neuron so that we understand how a nervous impulse is generated. We are going to certainly need to understand this for the production of normal movement. We also need to understand it for a lot of the different physical therapy interventions that we apply that attempt to stimulate muscles or relax muscles or relax other parts of the nervous system. So we'll start, of course, like every cell, with a cell body. And that's way up here at the top in this illustration. And this kind of brown button in the middle is the nucleus. But the cell body in a neuron is also called a soma. So neuron and nerve cell are synonymous terms. A nerve is made up of many, many neurons. So when we say a nerve, we mean something with lots and lots of nerve cells in it, or neurons in it. So anyway, here's the cell body. Called the soma or the perikaryon, and of course this does everything any other cell body would do. It kind of controls, regulates the nerve, nourishes all the elements of the nerve. Extending away from the body is the axon, and that's coming down here, coming all the way down, kind of splitting a little bit, and then lots of little terminations here. And generally, the axon conducts the nervous impulse away from the body of the nerve. And so you see this big red arrow here. That's indicating the direction of nerve impulse or signal transmission going down the axon. So this is usually going to some other structure. It could be to another nerve. It could be to a muscle, like we've talked about before. It could be just anywhere else. So we'll talk more about that, like targets of these impulses, in just a little bit. The axon relies on the cell body for its nourishment and everything, and so if an axon is cut, that part will generally die, the part that's cut away, and depending on where this neuron is located, it may or may not grow back and resume, and so we'll talk more about that. Axons also can have myelin around them, and this one that you see illustrated does have myelin, and you can see that it kind of looks like little segments of hot dogs in a bun connected together, and that's because the myelin develops in little discrete elements around the axon, and it's not one long continuous sheath, it's little segments of myelin sheath that are wrapped around the neuron. And myelin is essentially a fatty substance, and it helps to increase the speed of conductivity. And we'll go over that more when we go over the action potential. But basically, in the peripheral nervous system, we have what's called a Schwann cell. Now this is it's spelled the same as the Schwann ice cream guy, or the ice cream truck, but not quite the same. But this is the Schwann cell, that's the nucleus. And then the Schwann cell produces layers of myelin that wrap themselves around the axon. And so we have these Schwann cells located kind of dotted along the axon, and then each cell produces its own little segment of myelin. So you can see here how it's producing that, and it's wrapping around and around and around. In the peripheral nervous system, it's a different setup, even though myelin is still being produced. This is a great name. They're called oligodendrocytes, or sometimes they're called oligodendrogliocytes. So you know what cyte is, C-Y-T-E. What is that again? What does C-Y-T-E mean? Right, it means nerve. Or, sorry, it means cell. So in the central nervous system, you have oligodendrogliocytes or oligodendrocytes that are producing myelin. And again, they're producing just segments of myelin. You can see they're kind of suspended. So instead of one cell per the axon segment, yeah, this one cell, it always kind of reminds me of Spider-Man, like shooting out his webs to different areas and developing different segments of myelin in different parts of the cell. So here's again another illustration, a little more close up, of that oligodendrocyte producing myelin, though here for multiple neurons. Another element of the neuron is the dendrite. And there's typically only one or two, maybe two axons coming off, you can have a whole bunch of dendrites. And so typically they're on the other side of the body. So here's the body of the neuron, axon this way, dendrites up here, and you can see again multiple dendrites. And they're going to take in input and deliver it to the cell body. And what you see illustrated here are just different forms of neurons. They're all different shapes and styles of neurons that do different functions, that deliver impulses to different types of structures. And so here's some dendrites. Here's a little different where there is an axon on each side of the cell body, but again just the dendrites on this end. And then this is kind of an odd one where there's a cell body in the middle and the dendrites coming in, but it doesn't really look like there's an axon. So it's really, there's a whole bunch of different types of styles of neurons. But dendrites, again, take in impulses and deliver them to the cell body, and these are never myelinated. So here are just to get another example of different types of neurons, different shapes and styles. Some of them are named for their shapes, like the pyramidal cell, the ovoid cell. Some of them are named more for their function. And we aren't going to worry too much about the different kinds. We're just going to look at two basic types, which is the motor and the sensory neuron. So again, classification, this is going to fall into the idea of classification by function. So here's the sensory neuron, and we're going to be looking at this in more detail in a little bit. This is important for you to understand this structure. So here's the cell body up here, and then there's a little bit of axon coming each way. Receptors are out here, so for example, of course, if it's a sensory neuron, one of the places it would pick up sensation from would be in the skin. Here are the receptors, and we'll talk about different receptors in our part 4 of our lecture series here. But information comes in through the skin, so say somebody touches the skin, there's heat or cold being perceived or pain. That's going to stimulate a different receptor. That impulse is going to travel up this neuron, or this axon. You can see the axon's myelinated. Here's our cell body. We're going to finish delivering that. And then these dendrites are actually going to deliver, the axon bulb then is going to articulate with these other dendrites of this other neuron and deliver that information. In the motor neuron, it's constructed a little bit differently. Of course, the motor neuron is delivering an impulse to a muscle, and we have actually looked at this. Hopefully this looks familiar. This is a motor unit, one axon and the muscle fibers that it innervates. We've also looked in detail at this motor end plate where the motor neuron actually synapses with the muscle and how the impulses travels across from neuron to muscle. We looked at that with our muscle information. So the impulse here would be starting again up in the cell body. Dendrites surrounding the cell body bring in impulse, maybe up coming from the brain, for example, and sending that again along another myelinated axon, down the axon to where it would be delivered to the muscle and cause the muscle to contract. Most of the cell bodies for the motor neurons are located in a part of the spinal cord called the anterior horn, and we're going to be looking at that. We also have some in the brainstem and in the sympathetic ganglion. So for example, when we talk about blood vessels constricting, that's of course muscle that causes its contraction of smooth muscle in the artery that causes the vessel to constrict. That smooth muscle has to be innervated by something, and so we'd see some motor neurons in the sympathetic ganglion for that reason. And the sensory nerves, that cell body that I showed you, I'm sorry you can't see it right now, is in the dorsal ganglion just outside the spinal cord. So we will take a look at that as well. And that'll be where we kind of pick up in part 2. So that's it for right now, and you can end this video and go to part 2.